Welcome to our class. In this class, we will look at arrays and some functions that are commonly used with them. An array is a data type that contains several items called elements, and these elements store a value. The elements in an array can be accessed by using an index value or by using a key, depending on the type of array you are using. Arrays have a length, which is the number of elements that are contained in that array. In PHP, there are three kinds of an arrays. An index array, in which the elements are accessed using a numeric index. An associative array, in which the elements are accessed by using named keys. We also have multi-dimensional arrays, and this is an array that contains one or more arrays. So the elements in this array would be another array. Some commonly used functions. The count function, and by passing it the name of the array, it will return the length of that array. The print_r function, and by passing it the name of the array, it will enable us to display the array. This is a very useful function. You always want to test that you have all of the elements and values coded correctly by displaying it before you actually work with it. The for loop is commonly used to loop through an indexed array. The for each loop is commonly used to loop through an associative array. Let's take a look at creating a simple indexed array. There are three ways to create it. You can use the shorthand. First, you would declare the name of the array, whichever you want, and then you would assign the values. So here we have this array object, and we would indicate the values, value 1, value 2, value 3, etc. You also can set up the array as an empty array, or you can just populate it this way. So by storing the values inside the array elements individually, you would indicate the position by using the brackets. Arrays always start at index position 0. So here we have array element 0 storing a value, array element position 1 storing a value, it's the second element, the third element, index positions 2 storing a value. PHP 5.4 allows us another shortcut here. So rather than use the name of the array object, which we did initially up here, we can just declare the variable and populate the array using the brackets. Here again, the values are comma separated. So there are several ways of setting up an indexed array, and the elements are indicated by the index values. By accessing that index integer, we will return that value. So let's take a look at how we might work with an indexed array. Here I am setting up an array called states, and now I will populate it. I will use 3 states, California, New York, and North Carolina. If I wanted to loop through this array in order to display the results in the browser, I would need to determine how many elements. Granted, I could hard code it, but we want to do this programmatically. So here we have the count function passing the name of the array, storing it in this variable. Now in my for loop, because arrays are indexed based starting at 0, a for loop works very well. We will initialize our counting variable at 0, and we will set our condition I less than array length, our variable that holds the length, and then here's our increment counter. And you always want to just use an echo to test what you have before you start actually working with it. And here I have a literal expression, concatenated with my variables, and my array element index will return the value. And here I have some escape characters for my view source formatting. And because everything is inside the double quotes, the values of those variables are nicely interpreted. So here we see an output of what that might look like in the browser. So let's take a look at an associative array. An associative array uses named keys. Set up an associative array in the same manner in which we set up an indexed array. So to begin, we can declare the variable name, and here is this array object. This time we need to indicate the key and the value, just not the value, because we are working with named keys, not index position numbers starting at 0. So whatever the key is, we would code it in there, and this is our equal greater than sign. That's essentially pointing to the value being stored in that key. So we have 3 sets of our key value pairs. And by the way, these are all statements ending in a semicolon here. Now you can declare an empty array and then populate it later. So here again, we are still using our brackets when we populate it. The only difference is that rather than having 0 to begin with, we now have the name of the key. So key number 1 would be set to value number 1. Key number 2 would be set to value number 2. Key number 3 would be set to value number 3, etc. Again, in PHP 5.4, we have the shortcut where we can eliminate the need to use this array object by just declaring our variable and then assigning the key value pairs inside our brackets. So let's take a look at how we might loop through this associative array. Here I am setting up my associative array. I am calling it state tax, and here is my first key, it's California, and I'm assigning the value of California to 8.25 for the tax values. So we have a tax table here. Now my next element is my key New York, the value 8.875. My next element, the key is NC, and there's my value 7.75. So if I were to use the for each loop, and the for each loop is specifically set up to work with associative arrays, and it just natively knows how many elements are there, so we don't need to worry about using a count function here. So here we have the name of the array as $key is $value. So here we can loop through, and in our echo statement we have a literal expression here, and then we have our variable. So we're pulling out the variable for the key, we're pulling out the value for the key variable, we're pulling out the value for the value variable. Remember, these are just placeholders. And we'll loop through it. Here is our output in the browser. Let's take a look at a two-dimensional array. And this is an indexed array. A two-dimensional array is essentially an array that contains another array. So here we're starting out with our variable, state_stats, and we are populating the array. There's our array object, there's our opening left parenthesis, there's our closing right parenthesis, and our semicolon. But rather than populate it with elements that have an index value or a key, we are populating it with another array. So here's our first element, which is an array, comma, our second element, which is an array, comma, our third element, which is an array. What we're actually doing, we're laying out a two-dimensional table in rows and columns, very similar to something that you might see in a database. If we look at this code, and we're going to echo this back echo out these statements here. So here's my array name, and this first bracket is essentially the row. So this is my first row, and this is the 0 means the first column in my inner array, which is going to be the state. And if you look down here, there it is, it's California. And now I have a string expression here with my colon. Now I have a literal tax rate is state stat 0, we're still working with the first row, but what we're doing, we're accessing the value in the second column. So here we have an indexed array inside the array, the inner array, and that second column, which is indicated by position 1, is actually the tax rate, 8.25, and you can see it right down here. Now we have another string expression, and we're still in the first row, which is index position 0, and now we're in the inner array, and we're accessing index position 2, which is the third column, which is the population, and there it is. So in our second row, we're working with state stats 1, which is the second row, and here again 0 is the first column. We're still with row 1, 1 is the second column, we're still in row 1, 2 is the third column. And finally, we go down to our last row, which is indicated by the index position 2, and access those same columns. So this is an example of a two-dimensional indexed array. Let's take a look at a two-dimensional associative array. Here we have our variable declaration, and here's our array object, opening left parenthesis, closing left right parenthesis, and our semicolon. Rather than populating it with an indexed array, we're populating it with an associative array. So here we have our key value, key value, key value. So here's associative array 1, comma, associative array 2, comma, associative array 3. Now when we loop through this, because we have an associative array inside, we need to loop through each row at a time. So here, $row, it's our variable, equals 0. But this is our for loop, okay? And less than 3, I just hard-coded it in. We didn't have to do it that way. And here's row plus plus. So now, inside, we are actually using our index values coming from our for loop to indicate which row. So we have the first row, and now we're pulling out the first key in our inner array, which is state, and that will return value. Then we're working with that same row, 0, and we're going to retrieve the value for this key, which is tax rate. Now we're in the same row. This is our third key, and this is one index, one echo statement. It's just split up into several lines because it won't fit, concatenated. And we'll loop 3 times because we have position 0, 1, 2 in our outer array, but our inner array, we're working with our keys, not our numbers here. And this is our output. Let's take a look at some functions that work with arrays. We can dynamically generate an array with the range function here. So if we specified a starting point and an ending point, we could populate these values. Now obviously this only works with numbers. We also can indicate a gap between them. So if we have a starting point of 10, an ending point of 22, and we want a gap of 4, we can do that. So 10, 4 up is 14, 4 up is 18, and then we go to 22. So if we wanted to fill an array starting at 0, going up to 5 positions with this number, one number, here we just did that. A little different than range. It's the same value. If we had that same array stored in this variable numbers, and now we use this to pad it, here's my variable, and we're saying up to 10 starting with 0, or up to 10 padding with 0. So we're taking the original array, which had 5 elements, and we're going to add 5 more, up to 10 total, but we're going to pad it with 0. It doesn't have to be 0, it can be whatever you want. So these are functions that work with arrays. We can also merge arrays. So if we have an employees array here, and we have new hire, and if we want to use the array underscore merge with our 2, and we can essentially merge that and set it back to the original array name, and then we can print it to test that it indeed worked, and this is what it would return. We also can slice one array from another. So here we have our array employees, and we have 4 employees in it. And now we're going to slice this array starting at index position 2. So index position 2 would be 0, 1, 2. We're going to start with Ray. And if we were to store this new array in this variable and use print underscore r, which should be lowercase by the way, we would see we have Ray and print. We can also splice 2 arrays together. So here we have our employees array, we have 4 people in it. Our new hire, we have 2 people in it. And if we were to splice these, with these starting with index position 1, index position 2, with these 2 arrays, and print it out, we would see Mike, Ray, and print. Some functions for working with arrays that can add elements and remove elements. Push adds it to the end. Pop, array underscore pop, removes and returns the last value. Unshift adds to the beginning, and shift removes and returns the first value. So here, if we have this array of our 3 names, and we're going to use array underscore push, and we're working with the existing array, and we're passing it the value of Ray, it will add Ray to the end. So this is what it would return. And if we were to use array underscore pop, which would remove everything except the last, here we would see that it only is displaying Ray because it removes everything but the last. So here's our array again with 3 people in it. And if we were to use array underscore push, which adds to the end, here again we would add Ray. And if we were to use shift, which would remove and return the first value, it would display Mike because Mike is the first value. We also have some nice functions for sorting arrays. So sort would sort them in ascending order. If you wanted to work with numbers, you can pass a parameter, sort numeric. Sorting in descending order is rsort. And there are a few functions for working with associative arrays that allows you to sort by value ascending, key ascending, value descending, and key descending.